Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah from Westminster Libraries and Archives, and I'll be your moderator this evening. I'm joined by historian and director of Handheld Press, Kate Macdonald, and we'll be hearing about London ambulance volunteers in the Blitz, An Army Without Banners, a 1942 novel by Ann Stafford.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everybody, to this talk about a book that we published yesterday. We republished yesterday. Here it is, live and kicking. It's not a very long one. So when we begin to think, right, we're going to publish this book, the first thing we have to think about is the cover. Because if any of you have seen an earlier talk of mine, I talk about the processes of publishing. And if you don't have a cover, you cannot start marketing because you need an image. So this was the original. This is the original hardback from 1942. And you can see that this wartime dust wrapper used illustrations which appear in the book. So they did it quite economically. And they use a very Second World War font, because of course they would. Why would they not use a modern font as it would be then? Army Without Banners, Ann Stafford. So it's very plain. There's not a lot of design going on there, but it's interesting, but it wouldn't do now. Oh, no. So this is what originally I planned to do for the cover. This is a photograph by the well-known photographer John Hind, who did a lot of work for Picture Post and I think Life magazine in the Second World War. And he specialized in color photographs of people at war, basically. And this one is of an actual ambulance worker during the Blitz. So you can see her tin helmet. You can see the amazing lipstick, which I think must have been touched up, as well, probably was the color of her hair. And you can see the exhaustion on her face. And that's what originally attracted me to the image, because this represents what these people would have looked like. Trouble is, this image does not sell books, and our sales reps are going, no, we do not want this. We want a much more upbeat cover, something that's going to attract people, not put them off or make them feel sorry. So we went with this illustration instead, which is a lot cheerier. I think you have to agree. It's certainly not exhausting. It's got this sense of purposefulness rather than exhaustion. You've got vibrant, lively colors, but also a very limited palette rather than a sort of retouched color photography image, which just looks fresher all round. And the gauntlets in the woman's pose, they really make the picture for me, because it says practicality, hands-on work, capable and protective. I also changed the strap line at the bottom, because in the earlier version I was saying it was a memoir, but actually it's a novel. And to be fair, it's a novelized autobiography, but sort of swithering between the two genres. But for book selling purposes, it's fiction. So we went with a novel about the unsung army of women who picked up the pieces during the London Blitz. So the author is Ann Stafford, who many of you will never have heard of. Some of you may have done. And I'll come to that in a minute. In the 1930s, she was famous enough to be photographed by Hulton. And this photograph on the left is an image from the National Portrait Gallery archives. And you can see it if you go to the National Portrait Gallery website and just type in her name in the search bar, you'll get this picture come up so you can have a better look. So she's sitting here on the floor, on a cushion, looking at a book, and leaning over is another woman who is Jane Oliver. Now, for a long time, when I've been talking about this couple of writers in earlier talks, I got confused. I assumed that Jane Oliver was the one on the ground, because Jane Oliver was kind of the more lively and the younger of the two in this writing partnership. And for some reason, I just assumed the one with the vigorous action on the ground is Jane Oliver. But no, we can see from this other image that I found a lot later, obviously from the same photo shoots, that Ann Stafford is the one sitting on the cushion on the floor. Why were they doing this? Well, Helen Rees and Pedler were originally colleagues, and they used pen names of Jane Oliver and Ann Stafford when they began writing novels together. This photograph here on the top left is Helen Rees striding across probably a Scottish moor, looking very carefree, relaxed, very athletic. And behind her is Ann Pedler, who looks as though she's struggling a bit, and she's also carrying what seems to be a Macintosh. I'm pretty sure she was just as athletic as Helen, but in this particular picture, she's covering a sticky bit of the path, and having a bit of difficulty, which probably didn't represent her normal gait. Below is a picture of Anne Pedlar with her son John outside their house in Hampshire. He grew up to be a diplomat, and he died in November 2018. About a month before, I got in touch with Helen Rees's nephew, David Murdoch, who was the man who helped me sort out the rights and get first Business as Usual out to print, and then later Ann Stafford's Army Without Banners. Business as Usual is something we published, 2019, no, 2020, 21, I've forgotten now. And it is our runaway bestseller. It's a delightful novel about bookselling in the early 1930s, and Helen and Anne wrote it together because they had first met in their jobs. This is Anne again in the New Forest, riding Helen's horse, Brandy. And this is Anne wrestling with a very small black Labrador puppy. So let me tell you about Ann Stafford. Ann Stafford was the pen name of Anne Isabel Stafford Branfoot, later Pedlar, which was her married name. She was born in 1901, and her family came from County Durham. Her grandfather ran the Tyzac and Branfoot Steam Shipping Company, which he left after the First World War. Anne was educated at Cheltenham Ladies' College and at Newnham at Cambridge, and she graduated in French and Russian. She completed a PhD at King's College London in 1926 in Russian social history. She also studied art in Paris during the holidays, and her illustrations to some of her books are skilled and arresting, and you are going to see a lot of her illustrations later in this talk. She married the barrister Tom Simpson Pedlar in 1926, but by the early 1930s, she was no longer living with him, and she was living with her son. So obviously they either separated or divorced. We're not too clear about that. And she worked at the Times Book Club in the early 1930s, where Helen Evans, later to be Helen Rees, was her secretary. Now, the Times Book Club was what we would now just think of as a library. It was a subscription library for anyone who wanted to join it, run by the Times. So you would pay a sum of money every month or every year, and you would have books sent to you, brand new copies of novels, whatever. Subscription libraries were the rather more middle-class way of getting your books from a library, whereas borrowing libraries were for the people who had less money. Things changed later on in the 20th century. So back to Helen and to Anne, they collaborated on their first joint novel, which was published in 1933. That was Business as Usual, as well as on newspaper features and magazines. Anne went into writing for children and also romance and historical fiction from the 1930s right through to the 1960s, including many co-written with Helen and under a joint pen name. During the 1930s, Anne met the Polish writer Michel Lubin at an international pen club meeting in France, and she was able to sponsor Lubin and his family to come to the UK before Nazi Germany prevented Polish Jews from leaving at the beginning of the Second World War. And during the war, Anne was a volunteer ambulance driver from the Paddington Ambulance Station and was in charge of an East End advice bureau. And I think we'll find that that experience feeds directly into this novel, Army Without Banners. Helen, meanwhile, had married John Llewellyn Rees, who was a Welsh pilot 5 years younger than her, and they lived in Anne's house in St John's Wood. John was killed in 1940 in a bomber accident, and Helen continued to share Anne's house with her and John. And later, the two close friends lived next door to each other in North Goarly, Fordingbridge in Hampshire. Anne died in 1966 in Salisbury from cancer, and she'd been looked after in her last years by Helen. And she was also a great volunteer worker. She rose to a pretty high position in the Red Cross, and she was an avid rider, as we can see, and she maintained herself on her income from being a novelist, which is pretty stupendous. And yeah, she's just not remembered today, which is a real shame. Let's look at the Army Without Banners that she was writing about. These are the first images in the novel. There on the left, we have Mrs. Dove, who is the cook. She is the cook of Daphne Penward, who is the lady in the middle with the tin hat, holding 2 bottles of sherry that she's managed to find. And on the right, we have Belinda, a young neighbour of Daphne's, whose block of flats has been blown out. And Belinda is carrying some shopping in her steel helmet. And these are the people that Mildred first meets when Mildred finally arrives in London. Mildred and Daphne are cousins, and Mildred had been living a quiet country life during the war. Her husband and son had both gone off to fight, and she was not quite sure what she would do, and she was feeling rather dissatisfied with the usual Red Cross activities and women's voluntary service and so on. And then Daphne wrote to her saying, "I'm now an ambulance driver. We need drivers. You're a good driver. You've got a car. Come to London. You can stay at my house." So Mildred did it. She went to London. She moved in with Daphne, and she passed the ambulance driving test, and she was fitted out with her uniform, which she found rather disappointing. And as you can see from the picture on the right, it looks rather like a sack of potatoes tied in the middle. It does not suit her physique. She's also looking askance at the extremely primitive sleeping arrangements in the ambulance depot, where the people who are not on shift have to sleep and rest as best they can. Here on 2 chairs, a blanket, and an old packing case used as a bedside table for medicine, for a book, for the torch, and for a drink of water. These are the civil defence workers. Mildred and Daphne spend a lot of time driving out on shift, rescuing people, taking them to hospital and so on. And quite a lot of that time is spent waiting for roads to be cleared, waiting for administration to be completed, waiting for the all clear to be sounded so they can move off. And during these longeurs, these long periods of waiting around, Mildred observes the other civil defence workers who were working around London during and after the Blitz. On the left here, we have a welfare worker from the council. You can see she's got a hairnet on, carefully containing all that hair. And she's listening sternly but patiently to a woman who's been bombed out and who needs to be rehoused. And what can she do? In the middle, we have an air raid warden, very concerned about her administration and getting forms filled. And on the right, another air raid warden, and this one's been out all night. On this occasion, she's coming back to the ambulance station to check on a report that somebody had reported an unexploded bomb, because every single bomb has to be accounted for. And she looks exhausted. Here we have Mildred trying a different kind of civil defence work. She's doing canteen work. At the top left, she's trying to follow the young woman carrying a very large tray of cakes to put into the mobile van that takes the mobile canteen around to the different locations. Mildred is the one that has to carry these 2 very tall enamel jugs full of hot water, and she's making an absolute mess of it, slopping the water all over the floor. She won't last long in that role. In the top right, you can see Mildred wrestling with a tea urn and breaking at least 1 cup and saucer because the hot water has come out so fast. The canteen work is something that Mildred was trying out when she'd had quite a lot of experience in the ambulance field, but decided she wanted to see what other voluntary opportunities there were for keeping London going. The canteen work was the beginning. She later moved to a British restaurant, which Mrs. Dove, the cook, decided to introduce her to see if that would suit her. As was normal, she went straight to the kitchens, doing a lot of peeling of enormous sacks of potatoes and then doing an awful lot of washing up. And this is her trying to get the clean plates from the washing up area to the storage area. And we hope devoutly that she's not going to trip. She also begins to meet other volunteers who are not in the organised services. They're much more voluntary, if you like. They certainly, when I say civil defence volunteers, many of these people did get salaries or certainly hourly pay. But the other categories of voluntary workers got no pay whatsoever, and they merely joined together in well-organised, occasionally ad hoc groups to do the best they could to keep London going. At the top left, we've got ladies on a committee. In this case, it's a children's welfare committee, talking about the best thing to do with children whose parents have been separated from them and so on. And what I like very much here is the hats, because of course, women in this period did not go out of doors without wearing a hat, unless they were young and reckless and careless, or simply had just could not care because life was too difficult. But these middle-aged to elderly ladies are wearing very correct hats. They're all in skirts, and they're working on the paperwork at a knee-hole desk. On the top right, we have two elderly ladies who are specialists in salvage. We call it recycling now. But during the war, salvage was a relatively new thing. A little bit of it had been done during the First World War, but on a much more industrial scale. Civilian salvage became much more important during the Blitz and during the blockade, when supplies could not be got into Britain because of the U-boats. And so everything that was thrown out was scrutinized for the paper, for the metal, for any component that could be taken out and repurposed. In this case, we've got a lady looking at what looks like a casserole or possibly a baby's tin bath, because that could go towards plane making. Another woman is raking through a box of tins, checking that the paper has been taken off and put into the paper box. And there's a saucepan, which is out completely unusable because the handle's bent and it may well have a hole in it. That too will go to aluminium and scrap salvage. In the middle, we have my absolute favorite picture that Anne drew for this novel. This is what she called the Mayfair Warden, an extremely elegant lady in a gorgeous coat, probably fur trimmed at the neck, the collar and the wrists, with a brooch, and she's got her earrings on, and a lovely, lovely trim skirt, and enormous wellies, and a tin hat positioned just so. This woman was a formidable force for order on the streets. After a particularly bad barrage during daytime, people going to work would stop and stare at half-ruined houses, because this was a spectacle, seeing the insides of people's rooms and, oh my goodness, is that fireplace going to topple out? And is there anyone still living there? And wardens like this would chase them off, going, off you go, clear off before I get the police. This is not a circus. Because of course she had to keep the streets clear to get the ambulances through and the other defense vehicles. And here we have the people who are not working, who are not volunteering as such, but they're supporting each other. On the lower left, we've got a girl who in the novel is described as being a fashion illustrator. She works in the rag trade, and her job is to sketch the models, like the garments, the costumes, the dresses, the gowns that are being shown at fashion shows, so that the images can be used in the newspapers. But here she's volunteering with bombed out children, drawing them pictures, painting frescoes on the wall, just being a visual entertainer for the children. In the middle, we've got families who really want to get to the air raid shelter because there's been a warning, but the air raid shelters did not allow animals. So in this particular part of the East End, where Mildred was visiting a settlement, the settlement house, which was a house attached to a Christian parish, who would have church workers there supporting the local community. In this case, the people are bringing their household pets to the settlement house because they can put all the animals in the basement where they'll be safe during the raid, and they may as well just stay in the house themselves and hope not to be bombed. So we've got a woman with a cat. She's got her shawl around her head and the cat's trying to escape. Another woman with a baby and a parrot in a cage, and a little boy grabbing the dog, working very hard to stop the dog from wriggling out of his arms. On the bottom right, we've got ordinary people helping each other. We've got an old lady who, in her rush, has not tied up her parcels properly, and everything has crashed to the ground. And two young women have stopped and they're about to help her. And I just love the picture here of, we got a young woman wearing trousers, quite ordinary. For us, trousers and women is completely normal. But in the 1940s, women rarely wore trousers in public unless it was part of a uniform, or on the beach as palazzo pants on the Riviera, which is a very small minority of the population, but you get my drift. But here we have a woman in high heels and long trousers and a tight jacket. She may be on the way to work. Maybe she's a bus conductor. Perhaps she works in a factory. And beside her is a woman in slightly more feminine gear with a dress with a sweetheart neckline. We've got the curly perm and the hat. The woman in trousers doesn't have a hat. Perhaps she didn't need one. But they're both poised to help the older woman. Later on in the novel, Mildred decides to visit the river, because on the river, there's a great deal of other voluntary service going on, as well as service. This is a world that's much less often recorded. We've got a girl here from the River Ambulance Service, deftly climbing the ladder to get aboard her ship. The River Ambulance Service, I don't know much about it. I had to do a little research so I could, write the notes for the end of the book. But there was a fleet of boats which were ambulances sent up and down the river to collect people to take them to hospital, because the river was and still is a thoroughfare just as much as roads were. And the river was less often likely to be blocked because the shipping kept its lights down and wasn't bombed. So a road that was blocked with vehicles was nothing like as passable as a river. On the right, we got a girl doing her semaphore, signaling up and down the river, also from the river emergency services. And in the middle, we've got one of the most extraordinary pictures. It doesn't look like much to me or you, but these are women dock workers. I had no idea that women were working as porters in the London docks during the war. If you think about it logically, of course they would have had to, because so many men had gone off to the military services. But yet the incoming ships still needed to be unloaded, the docks needed to be serviced, and these are two or three of the women who are doing that job in their trousers, sturdy and quite muscular looking. And finally, we have a drawing that sums up what this novel is about, focusing attention on what ordinary Londoners were suffering with the bombs. This young woman is feeding her baby with her toddler asleep, leaning against her when she's sitting on the curb edge. Perhaps her home has gone. Perhaps she has no idea what she can do next. But the vast apparatus of volunteer networks that were growing and establishing themselves during the war will help her, and she will find the help she needs. But the baby has to be fed first.
I just want to say that we had a comment from Fiona who said that her grandparents' house in Edinburgh was a depot for collecting tins, pans, etc. during World War II.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
The illustrations, but was it Anne Stafford that drew them, or
She did.
she's
Ann
the one who
Stafford
drew
was.
them?
I mentioned that she went to Paris to study art during her
Yeah.
university holidays. Well, clearly illustrating was something she did really well, and Business as Usual is packed with very similar illustrations. And I was just so delighted that, this too was an illustrated book, because it just adds so much to how the story is told. You get these gorgeous vignettes, these little sketches of people taken from the life. So these are real Londoners from 1941, 1940 during the Blitz. They're, I think, just a wonderful historical record, as well as being delightful to look at.
Laura. Hello, Laura.
Hello.
Good afternoon. At the end of this last segment, you mentioned a network, and the name of it went by very quickly. I didn't hear it. It was about feeding the children who were unhoused.
Okay, yes, it was. I don't know if it was a network. It was the settlement I was talking about. The settlement houses. Okay, so I'll go back a bit. So in the late Victorian period, the Church of England began to establish in the East End of London, which was one of the poorest areas of the UK, what they called settlement houses. So they would rent or even buy a large house, and they would put church workers into it to live there among the community in the slums and do support work. So the men would do preaching, they would also do practical hands-on work, they would do fundraising, they would do classes, and women settlement workers would be part of that work as well. So this is a tradition from the late Victorian period. In the Second World War, the settlement houses still existed, and the church was a very strong community support node, if you like. And this particular settlement house that Mildred in the novel goes to visit, she, the settlement worker that lives there, arranges for all the animals and pets to be brought to her basement during the air raid, so the animals have got some protection. And it's just an example in the novel of the kind of work that can be done by ordinary people and also by the church in its historical setting. Does that explain? Do you think that's right?
It does. Thank you very much.
Cool. Okay.
Okay, we have another question that came in the Q&A. How many books did Ann Stafford write and have been published?
Right. I counted when I did Business as Usual, I did the sums, and I did a lot of bibliographic research. And I think between the two of them, Helen Rees and Ann Pedler, Ann Stafford, Jane Oliver, they published 92 novels between them. I would have to run over to the other side of the room and work out the numbers for how much Anne and Helen published individually, but they did publish quite a few as joint co-authors. So they were all published from 1933 right through to, well, Anne died in 66. I think Helen wrote a couple more in the late 60s. But to my knowledge, none have been republished since then, except for Business as Usual and now Army Without Banners. You can still find them. They're in libraries still. I think especially in Scotland. Helen Rees, Helen Evans or Jane Oliver, she specialised in Scottish historical novels, and she quite often wrote a children's novel and an adult's novel on the same subject, the same plot. So her research would cover two books. And because a lot of it was about Scottish history, because she came from southern Scotland, the Scottish Library networks have a lot of her books. Ann Stafford is a lot harder to find. Personally, I would look on abebooks.co.uk or abebooks.com and see what you can find there, because that's just the widest spread of secondhand books available.
So we have a comment and a question from Ava. She says, I'm a bit surprised that there would have been a drawing of a mother nursing her baby. Wasn't portraying that action considered something that would be private in the 1940s?
Well, I had a bit of a discussion on Twitter with this when I first publicized that image, because I thought it was rare, quite surprising. Yes, I think it would contravene what was considered standards of public decency at the time to depict a woman in print breastfeeding, unless it came under the colonial banner. So you might get people from other countries photographed by press photographers, and a woman breastfeeding in a colonial setting would be considered a fit subject for photography. But in a Western setting, a woman breastfeeding, very unusual, and probably only considered acceptable if you were depicting poverty. So I can now recall from memory an image of a Romany or traveler family where the woman is breastfeeding. I can also recall images from the American Depression, the Dust Bowl photographs, the photographs of the people who had to travel because of drought in the American West to get jobs in the far West Coast. I'm sure I've seen images of women breastfeeding there. But again and again, it's about poverty. It's not about this is a normal thing to do. It's about these women are driven to such straits of desperation that this is all they can do. And I agree, it's very unusual. I suspect because it was an illustration rather than a photograph, and it was wartime, so censorship wouldn't have been that active at the time. I think that's how it got through. And I think the enlightened attitude of her publisher probably allowed it through too. But it's remarkable. It's a rare, rare image from the period of such a subject.
I have a comment from someone. I'm probably going to pronounce the location wrong, but bear with me. I once met a man in Wapping whose childhood home was stuffed with sugar, secreted all over the house, as his mother was a dealer in otherwise rationed goods, which just so happened to fall off the ships as they unloaded at the port of London, straight into local hands. Women also did a bit of that during the war.
That is amazing. Yeah, I can absolutely believe it. Yeah, I haven't done much research on the black market and how it operated, and I don't know that much evidence still exists. But yes, I believe you. That's entirely plausible that went on, and that people had to engage in that kind of practice.
A question and then a comment. So I'm going to read the comment first. Jill says, those Dust Bowl photos were by another pioneer woman called Dorothea Lang.
That's the word. Thank you. Yeah.
And the question was, could the audience hear a short reading of
I can do that.
Stafford's book?
Yes. Okay. I will read you from the beginning Daphne's letter to Mildred and what Mildred thought about it and what she did. So Mildred lives in the country. Her husband is called George, and her little boy is not a little boy. Her son, who must be about 18 or 19, his name is Toddy. Just is a nickname. The letter begins. It was dated September 1940. Dear Mildred, I've been wondering about you in your nice country cottage. We have had nearly a month of Blitz now, and it is horrid. Every morning we wake up thanking God we are still alive. You wouldn't know your London. Everybody lives in basements or on the ground floor, or sleeps in tubes or shelters. I'm working at the ambulance station just up the road. Been there 6 months. They used to laugh at us and call the job our wartime rest. chuck tomatoes over the yard fence at us and so on. But now we're busy. It's a pity you were stuck down there in the country. You could be very useful here. We're short of good drivers. If you want a war job, here's one that wants you. Only perhaps you'd better not come, not at your age, and you were always the nervous one. We go out in all raids and in all times. I can't bear bodies and wounds, so I feel fearful, but so far have carried through, praying loudly all the time. Enough said. Frightful din of planes overhead. I am waiting to go out. Third ambulance. 2 have gone already. There's the phone. That means me. Much love, Daphne. The first time I read it, I didn't really take it in. I kept saying, but this can't be Daphne. Daphne wouldn't be in London. This can't be Daphne, my lovely, elegant cousin Daphne, going through all those horrors. Because you knew at once that behind the curt words of her letter, there were horrors you'd never dreamed of, horrors you could not imagine, and courage to match them. The words of the news bulletins came flicking in and out of my mind. Sharp raid on central London, considerable damage, casualties are feared to be heavy. But they weren't just casualties anymore. Statistics on an official form, items in a news bulletin. They were people like Daphne, men and women that Daphne and I had passed in the street, who'd kept little shops where we'd bought cigarettes and cabbages and newspapers, who'd sold us tickets for cinemas and concerts, fitted us with shoes and frocks and hats, coughed over us in buses, sat beside us in theatres and music halls, and laughed at the same jokes. I hated Daphne's letter. That sentence about being useful, it hurt. It was like the cruel knock on the door, the relentless hand that hauls you up from sleep when the dream is sweet. I could be very useful. Poor London. I could be very useful. It wasn't enough just to say poor London when one could be very useful. Impossible to pretend any longer that it was enough, if one could be very useful. There wasn't any longer just one of me, one middle-aged woman sitting in a chintz armchair in a country cottage. There were 3 of me. One who wanted to rush to the telephone and wire that I was coming at once. The one who only wanted to be left to go on dreaming. And the one who was a kind of umpire at the quarrel. I could hear myself saying, but I wouldn't be any use. I'm too old. I'm too fat. And the other me arguing that Daphne was as middle-aged, if not more so. She had grandchildren. What she could do, I could do. What she could bear, I could bear. There were thousands of women feeling just as bad as me at this very minute. And if they all gave in, there wouldn't be enough people for the jobs there were to do. Then I heard myself remembering all the jobs I was doing already. The first aid post in the village, the knitting groups and the committees and all the local nonsense, and George and Toddy. All that day, I put off answering Daphne's letter. All that day, I umpired, and first the self that wanted to stay would win, and then the self that wanted to go. I tried to escape from both of them by making jam and mothballing George's +4s and winding wool and picking fruit. But wherever I went, wherever I looked, I kept seeing London. London streets, the leaves fanning from the trees by the embankment where George and I had so often walked, and Hampstead Heath, garlanded with funfairs on bank holidays, and Toddy straining at my hand towards the swings. The King's Road, Chelsea, on a Saturday night, Mile End on a wet morning, Walworth when the spring sunshine brought the flower barrows out, and Westminster Bridge on a misty day with the trams grinding across it and tugs wailing from the river. The pictures kept on shifting and changing, blurring into one another, but always as they blended, some woman's figure would usurp the foreground, now sleek and elegant in furs, now shabby in a sagging coat and skirt, or muffled in a shaggy shawl with a man's cap aslant above curlers. The face changed with every setting, but the look of appeal in the eye was always the same. Whether you liked it or not, all these people were somehow part of yourself. All the men and women you scarcely remembered seeing, the thousands of them you didn't know, their lives impinged on yours, twined round yours. And if you could be useful, then you had to go and help them. If you could be useful. But you couldn't be useful if you were afraid. I knew then that I should be frightened, and badly frightened too. I tried to say that at 41 I was past being brave, that I was too old a dog for new tricks. But at 41 you'd had plenty of life, a long good gulp of it, and it had tasted sweet enough. That was why at 41 you ought to be ready to take chances. It wasn't really the young women who ought to be in danger, the young and the gay who could serve in the WAF or the Wrens or the ATS, who had boyfriends to love them, who would marry and have children, to whom, if they lived, the blessed years of peace would belong. It was the older women who should take the knocks, the faithless generation, nurtured between two wars. People like Daphne, people like me, all the millions of women who hadn't been trained for anything very special, who'd had dull lives or hard lives or easy lives, brought up their families and seen their men go off to war, the women who wouldn't cut a fine figure in a fancy uniform and didn't care. They were the women who were wanted in the Blitz cities like London. I didn't wire to Daphne. I wrote. I said I would come up and see if I could be any use, and if she could lend me a corner of her basement to sleep in, that would be fine. Before the letter had even left the pillar at the end of the road, I had been to the house agent and arranged to let the cottage, and that evening I began to pack. So I hope that will encourage you, that you might quite like to read the book, and you can buy it from any good and useful bookshop in America as well as in the UK, and in fact worldwide, but you can definitely get it more easily from bookshops in those two countries. And you can buy it from me, handheldpress.co.uk, and I will be very happy to pack one and send it off to you.
Want to see more from us? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to click like, subscribe, or new content alert.